So I think it was really important to start off the day with that very broad context and all of the technical and governance and policy issues that are emerging around data. I think that what would be helpful is our next series of presenters are going to continue to bring this down and scale these concentric networks that we operate within, and really give us a clear picture and help us to clearly define what question we're asking, as Teresa so clearly put it, that we need data to answer, and in our cases, what outcomes are we looking to move in specific outcome areas as an alliance to further the data that we need. And so at this time, I would like to introduce Jeff Edmondson, Managing Director of Strive Together National Network. Jeff so graciously has joined us and has been a great partner as we develop the New York State Cradle to Career Alliance as an intermediary of the national network. And so Jeff is going to say some remarks about the developing picture as far as data in the national C2C context. Thanks, Jeff.
Wow, that was, I think I just confirmed that I am definitely a data geek, because I loved that presentation. I was like on the edge of my seat. So thank you for that. That was just amazing. All right. So I am going to try to contextualize that a little bit of how and why we think data is so important to this work. But before we do that, I want to actually ask you all to look to somebody next to you or right behind you and answer this question. What questions do you have? What questions do you have about the use of data in building cradle-to-career partnerships? So you just heard this, what I thought, and I'm sure you did too, was this incredible presentation about the changing landscape of data globally, nationally, statewide. But what questions do you have in your work right now about how data is relevant to your work in building cradle-to-career partnerships? All right, is that a clear question? So look to the person next to you, take 3 minutes, and just ask, and then I'm going to ask for a few of those questions. So go ahead, 3 minutes. All right, bring it back together. Let's bring it back if we can. All right. So very quickly, can I just have a few people volunteer to shout out what your questions are about how data is relevant to your work in building cradle-to-career partnerships? Anybody? Don't all jump at once. Anybody? Anybody? Yes?
What are the data elements that we will need to collect in the future to answer questions that we may have now?
What are data elements that we will need in the future to answer questions that we may have now? That almost sounds existential in nature. I'm trying to...
What Teresa was saying, it took 18 months to have a definition, and then the next process is going out. So what are the questions that we need to ask now? And then from that, what are the data elements if we're ever going to answer those questions?
Great. Okay, good. Good. Great. Other questions? Yes?
I'm going to ask the reverse question.
Okay. The reverse.
The reverse. Because today, we cannot bound people to ask the right question. It's impossible. Or they ask the right question today, but tomorrow they will ask a new question. And so we have to be able to develop data systems which are rich enough to answer the questions that have not been asked yet.
Wow. This is really deep. I wish I had brushed up on my Lao Chu before coming here, but I get it. This is good. Yes.
Why, when we have fairly good data, do we change the way we measure it so that you can no longer look at trends? You move from
Yeah.
measuring to Common Core, and all of a sudden it's like we did nothing in the past. And in business, you run multiple systems so that you know how to do that trending. We just
So at what point do we kind of stabilize on the measurements?
you might need to change them, but come up with a process that doesn't say I now no longer can look at
Got it. Yeah.
2004 to compare going forward.
All right, great. Just a couple more. Yes.
How do we overcome the bias against individual data in education when we already have individual data sets in healthcare? What is the problem?
Got it. All right, this individual data set. This is a big nut to crack. Got it. Good. One more? Yeah?
Why don't we have local level data that's available in all of the health and human services? It goes to the county only.
Interesting. Is that getting a little bit to the cartoon of data versus information? Meaning we may have the data, but it's not being given back? Or are you just saying, why don't we have the data at all?
Relevant.
It's not relevant.
Geographic scale.
Okay, great. Oh, okay, so at that geographic scale.
Yeah.
All right.
Needs to come down.
Okay, great. All right. So what's interesting to me about this is that there are, and it's good that we have a state policy leader here in our midst, right? But a lot of this has to do with policy issues, right? I mean, we've got to deal with the policy issues. But what I think was a really great way to close out that conversation is that what we can do with these cradle to career partnerships is begin to create the demand for the right kind of information. Right? We can create the demand and essentially inform the people, whether it's policymakers or data geeks or whatever you want to call them, that this is what we need in order to make the right decisions. And it may be a different geographic scope. It may need to be individual student identifiers. Whatever it is, we can begin to push for what we want rather than let them define what we want at a state or federal level, right? So that's really the power of it. So very quickly, I didn't recognize everybody in here. I recognize a lot of friendly faces. It's so great to see people that have been at this for so long. But I did want to very quickly just give you another cartoon about sort of why we're all here, just as a quick reminder, right? We're here because in general, the adults are pointing at each other. This comes from Albuquerque, which is building a cradle to career partnership. And the question is, how do we stop getting folks to point at each other and begin to embrace this work? And the concept that we're all aligned behind, just to make sure we're all on the same page, is this idea of collective impact, right? This high, and the question is, how is collaboration, typical collaboration, different than collective impact? And we have these 4 things that, for us, help to frame how this work is a bit different. The first one is that we're not convening around programs, we're convening around outcomes, right? Next is that we're not using data just to prove things, we're using data to improve things. Right? Meaning we're not just saying this worked and this didn't, and because this worked, we're just going to do that, and this didn't, we're going to never do that again. We're going to say, how do we just constantly improve over time to build on what works? Next is it's not in addition to what you do, it should be what you do, because what should be happening as a result of this data work is that teachers, early child care providers, after school programs should be able to get the data they need to inform their work every day, right? Rather than just do new stuff on top of everything else they're doing. And the last thing is we shouldn't be able to just advocate for ideas. We should be able to advocate for what works, right? We should be able to say, we know what works now because we're using the data in the right way to get results. Now, what is the common theme in this little diagram? What is the common theme? Data, right? So when we think about this jump from traditional collaboration to actually doing this work of collective impact, the core of it, the heart of it, is how we are using data. And so as we begin to think nationally, and that's what my job and what Jennifer Blatz and Jennifer Perkins, and we have Heidi here too, just to prove you that we don't only hire people with the name Jennifer, that what we're thinking about every day is across the country, how do we begin to build that infrastructure that enables us to use data more effectively, all right? So I thought what I could do is contextualize for you, what do we mean by using data more effectively, right? What do we actually mean by that? So we've created this theory of action that says essentially that if you're going to use data effectively, initially you just need to get agreement on what the data points are. That's exploring. In emerging, you need to begin reporting that data better, and you need to be able to disaggregate it to understand where your challenges are. But then to move to sustaining, you're actually using data on the ground. Once again, you're hearing data over and over again. You're using data on the ground to inform action. And then when you get to systems change, you're actually using data to inform how you spend your money, right? Or your time, or your talent is being driven by the use of data. And the last proof point is when the data and indicators are trending in the right direction. Once again, the definition of quality and collective impact as we've defined it is all about using data effectively, right? But what does that mean practically on the ground across all these communities? Well, there's 3 different ways that people talk about using data. If you start at the bottom, it's reporting and accountability. Next is evaluation and research. And finally is continuous improvement. And I want to give you a couple examples around 2 of these areas. Because I'm guessing, because we're at SUNY, and a lot of you are familiar with higher ed, you're pretty good at that middle one, right? Research and evaluation. We've found that in communities, universities are often very good at that piece. But the question is, how do we effectively do reporting? And more importantly, how do we effectively practice continuous improvement when we're using data in communities across the country? So very quickly on the first one of reporting and accountability, across the network nationally, one of the things we are trying to do is get folks to agree that you may not have the exact same indicators, but there are some common outcome areas that everybody seems to care about. And I was even looking at this beautiful visual way over here that I think this is one of my new favorite pictures, and I'm a very visual person. But I love how this is organized. What I was thinking is if you looked at those boxes on the bottom, all of those initiatives connect to one of these outcome areas, right? Kindergarten readiness, early grade reading, high school graduation, college entrance, retention, completion. These are the outcome areas that it seems like everybody's caring about. So if we're going to demonstrate the power of collective impact nationally, we need to have a consistent set of outcomes, right? Once again, not the indicators, because they're different everywhere, unfortunately, right? They're different everywhere. You know, New Mexico, where Albuquerque is, has different indicators for kindergarten readiness than we have in New York. But these core outcome areas are really critical, and we want to add a 6th eventually around a 7th, around career placement or career wage. What am I talking about? You know what I'm talking about. Okay, a 7th one further down. Okay, but the point being is that there are 6 that are somewhat consistent. So across the national network, we are hoping to have some consistency to what these indicators are. In New York, because you have such a critical mass of sites, we are hoping that across all these communities, you can also be reporting on these indicators and others that are important to you as well. But these indicators are core for us to be able to demonstrate the power of how we're using data effectively, and that you will report annually on where your trend lines are, right? And this is really critical. It's not to report to people, but it's to report with people. So in communities, when you report your data, don't just have the superintendent stand up and present his or her K-12 data. Have a business leader stand up and report it, or have a superintendent or a president or a chancellor stand up and report it, so that people start to understand that they are collectively owning the data, and hopefully they're disaggregating it so that they can really understand where the biggest challenges are and where they may be having successes or not, right? So that's the reporting side. And that's pretty clear cut. But the big thing here is that as part of these Cradle to Career partnerships, we should not be creating report cards that are separate, right, from what everybody else is doing. It should be part of how the community is using data. All right, does that make sense? So that's one piece, the reporting and accountability piece. I'm skipping right over the evaluation and research stuff because that's what we've done in the social sector for years. But the most important point, and what we think is going to be the way that Cradle to Career partnerships drive demand for data, is around this piece of continuous improvement. Because that's what's going to make this work different, is whether or not we're actually using data every day to try to serve children better, not after a 5-year double-blind randomized controlled trial. We are using data every single day, and we're asking these data geeks as to one of the questions, what is it? What is the data that we need to improve every single day, right? So a couple very quick examples, and I'm out of time, but I'm going to do this anyway. I'm just going to be a rebel. That's what I'm going to be, because in this work, we all need to be rebels, right? Don't we? A little bit? Are you all with me still? You're still with me. Are you okay? We're going to be okay. All right, thanks, Vanessa. All right. So the overview of continuous improvement is this. We're not using data for evaluation long-term. We're using data each and every day, right? That's what this is supposed to represent, using data every single day. So a couple concrete, a couple points on what it is and what it is not. Continuous improvement is a culture and a mindset. It is totally different than evaluation. So don't act like it's the same thing. Evaluation's valuable for what it does. Continuous improvement is different. We're using it as we're using it as a methodology to improve what we do every day. It's intentional. It's not only strategic planning. We're not using data one time, right, to develop a plan. We're using it on an ongoing basis. It involves leadership and frontline practitioners, which is really critical because a lot of times we use data from the top down. This is empowering practitioners with the data so that they can use it from the bottom up. And then it's iterative. You're constantly using it. It's not just a one-time thing. Does that make sense? All right? So this is what the shift in mentality is around using data as part of this work. So a couple of very quick examples. College enrollment, right? If one of those outcomes, those 6 outcomes that we're tracking is college enrollment, the way that we're talking about using data for continuous improvement is not for us to study for 3 years what worked to move college enrollment levels in your community. What we're saying is right now, could we look at programmatic data? What is being done to get kids to enroll in college? Is it college visits? Is it one-on-one advising? Is it financial advising? Is it whatever it is? What is being done? And can we connect what is being done to the outcome we want to move? Can we collect that kind of data? And most of the practitioners out there, they're not collecting good programmatic data. Most of them are just collecting whether or not they serve somebody. That doesn't tell us what we need to know. So our first job as Cradle to Career Partnerships is to make sure we are actually collecting the right kind of data. And when we looked at the college access programs in Cincinnati, only a few of them were collecting really good data on what they did with kids. But that's okay, we used that data anyway. And when we looked at that data, it turned out that the practice that was moving the dial was financial aid advising. How many of you have filled out financial aid forms? It turned out that when we really looked at the data, the people that were advising on financial aid, those kids were the ones that were going into college. So the question was, how do we get the existing college access programs to incorporate financial aid advising into what they do? Does that make sense? It's not let's start a new financial aid program. How do we get the existing programs to do more of that practice? Does that work? That's continuous improvement. And then we look again and we say, oh, you know what? When we look at the data now, if we did financial aid advising with the parent, that worked better than just doing it with the child. Okay, now let's make sure the parents are involved. And then we keep looking at the data. Oh, maybe the grandparent needs to be there too. I don't know. But we keep looking at the data and we don't stop. It's constant and iterative. Does that work? All right, last example, and then I'm almost done, I promise. This is from Dallas. This is a very rough example, but it gives you an idea. They created what they called the hope chart. And they plotted all the elementary schools, free and reduced lunch on the bottom, and proficiency on the side, right? And they looked at the data and they said, okay, we have a 50% achievement gap here for the kids that are in low-income schools, and we only have a 10% or 15% gap up here for kids that are in higher level income schools. And what do most people do with the data at that point? They say that's what it is, and then that's it, right? They do what somebody in one of the communities we work with called admiring the problem. Right? We're like, oh, that's just horrible. And then we go back and do the exact same thing. Right? We go back and do exactly what we were doing the day before, and nothing's going to change. Right? What we're talking about is, oh, okay, what could we learn from the people up here who are working in schools so that they could begin to work with the folks here, and they could not act like one's better than the other, but they could have a conversation about how what is going on could potentially be relevant in their learning environments. Maybe it's that there's a low student-teacher ratio. I don't know. Maybe it's that there's a certain type of leadership in the school. I don't know what it is, but they begin to uncover what's actually working and what's not, and over time they continuously use data to improve. Does that make sense? Another example, very rough example of what continuous improvement is versus evaluation and research. So our hope would be is that over time we are able to use data in that way so that we're mobilizing the time, the talent, the treasure, the people, the skills, the money behind what actually works for kids, because we, back to the presentation we just had, we in these Cradle to Career Partnerships are able to tell the data analysts of the world, the data geeks of the world at the state, the federal level, the data that we need in order to make better decisions on the ground. And that is the type of data that should be being collected consistently over time. Does that make sense? All right. Is everybody with me except Vanessa, who's pissed at me? All right. But are we? Does this make sense? Okay. So this is what we're trying to do at the national level. What I am going to do is hand it off to Caitlin Gambrill, who is a vice chancellor here. She is a person of incredible talent. I'm going to talk even faster. Okay. who is going to talk about across the SUNY system, how is this work being incorporated in order to make sure that you all are empowered as much as possible with the data that you need to be successful. Okay? And then Vanessa's going to talk about across the Alliance.
Say Jeff.
Uh-huh.